course, we're still allowed in the work that we do to choose whether we self-disclose. You may have been trained in a way, and this was true for me, where I was trained to do little if any self-disclosure in the context of therapeutic work. But many people I know and lots of other different training perspectives talk about a lot of self-disclosure or self-disclosure as an important therapeutic act. So at least with in some degree some feminist therapy orientations, humanistic orientations, and more so CBT than dynamically oriented therapists. We'll talk about self-disclosure for a variety of reasons. Normalizing an experience or a concern that a person has. Yes, I've experienced that too. Fostering or repairing alliances. Heightening trust, and also addressing credibility issues. You were mentioning when we were talking about substance abuse, where clients or people who are providing services may also be in recovery. It's very common in substance abuse treatment settings for people to disclose their status in terms of recovery. So there aren't, as you all know, strict ethical rules saying you cannot do this. There is a zone here of choice based in part about our particular relationship with a particular client or within an organization, as well as our theoretical orientation and our sense of the utility of those disclosures. When we do have the choice, one of the things that I think is useful to consider is that it is the idea of self-disclosure is along a continuum of intimacy with clients or distance. And it's a continuum, not one that I've invented. There are folks who write about boundaries a lot who've talked about this, but that it's really useful to consider how close do I get in this context, how distant do I get, and that it may change depending on a particular client or set of clients or environment. There are, of course, outer limits. Sexual intimacies are never okay. Physical assaults are never okay, just in case you didn't know that. I figured I'd let you know. It's probably not surprised anybody. But there's a lot of room between those extremes. Okay? And the idea is considering along the intimacy-distance continuum, what's the optimal place to be in terms of providing services? And it varies. And it varies with different clients. When we work with kids, sometimes kids will ask very personal questions. We're going to have a different response than an adult or a member of a couple asking you the same question. Okay? So who the client is matters. Of course, there is the unavoidable, as Overzer talked about it, person in the room disclosures, just who we are. There's also the fact that we can enact affect, kind of our countertransference. And this is subtle, and it happens all the time. Somebody, client says something that, they say, well, I've decided, I'm going to break up with my partner and I'm moving to New Zealand. Really? It's like nonverbal reactions are powerful. They're quick, often not within our control. To some extent they can be. But therapist affect can be enacted in a small way. It can be enacted in a bigger way. Disclosure of that affect, when we use our affect to, partly as an intervention. When you talk like that, I feel sad hearing you describe yourself that way. There may be good reasons or not so good reasons clinically to use that kind of intervention, but that's another way one can disclose information. And then, of course, there's the intentional disclosure of personal information. Most of us are really familiar, and many of us have been trained, have no personal photographs in your office, nothing of family or friends or people who are important, but therapists vary along that particular dimension. When clients ask us, are you married? Actually exploring it first before saying yes or no. Right? So there are different stylistic ways of addressing this, but people ask us for personal information all the time, don't they? I mean, what kind of information have you been asked for by clients? What are the questions you've gotten? Do you have children?
Where do you live?
Where do you live? What, you don't know already? It's on the web. Yeah. The children one, that was a question that Anna Freud was asked by her kids very frequently. Do you have children? And her answer was interesting. She said, all of the children I see are my children. She dodged it, in other words. She didn't answer. Other questions that you've gotten? I've been asked about having children. Since I see almost exclusively couples, I get asked questions about whether I'm married and also whether I've been divorced, which I take as partly diagnostic of who's seeking to split up the relationship at a particular time. Really. I think when people ask me if I'm divorced or have been, part of it is, are you going to support me? And are you going to be able to hear me and understand? But that's often the question, isn't it? Whether it's, do you have children? You know, where do you live? Where do you go to school? Where are you from? Occasionally I get the question, where are you from? You know? Yeah. How do you not take it home? But it's a wonderful question in many ways, Pat, because it's really about, I mean, flipping it around, it's like that sense that people have of being burdening you, right? And again, it's all of it's usable, and we're going to fumble sometimes. People ask us questions, we go, I didn't expect that. And even if we've had practice, you know, and we can with kids, you know, or saying, I answer the way you answer very often, which is, you know, I'm happy to answer you about whether I'm married or I've been divorced, but I'm wondering if you have a concern or a worry, or if you're thinking about it. And sometimes it's, I was thinking of matching you up with someone, you seem like a catch, or maybe not, or who would get to say married to you, whatever it may be, you know. But most of the time, we get to choose if we respond in a direct fashion or we respond in a fashion that is about, well, wonder what worries you about that, you know. And I think there can be value to both, and particularly with people who are struggling with a specific kind of problem. Oftentimes, they're just knowing, well, yes, I have kids, or you know, I explore the difficulty with them, and yeah, I do have kids. Oh, then you will understand, even though I may not have a clue as to what they're describing. But we make decisions about things like increasing alliance, and we also take risks in doing so. Because sometimes we disclose information. For example, a couple comes in and one says, are you married? And I really feel trepidatious about responding. Because I have a feeling they're asking me whether I have been divorced. That is, they're wondering, can I understand them? So sometimes that opaque nature is really important. But we make those decisions. It's maybe a technical error sometimes, but not in itself an ethical problem, unless the self-disclosures are for us. That is, if I'm interested in showing off what I'm doing, yeah. Will you be safe? Of course. That's actually one of those questions that can be really important, that's personal. Right. Because there may be clients who say, I only want to work with a really strongly Christian therapist, or a strongly faith-based, any kind of faith-based therapist. And to me, people get to make those choices. That's something, whether I agree with that or not, that's a choice that clients get to make. So that's personal. And you'll notice that what our clients in our studies search for is, there were a chunk of them searching for the religion. About 20%, 15-20% were looking for therapist religion. And I suspect in part for the same reasons that you're describing. Are you conservative enough? It's rare though, right, Pat, when you have a client ask you, how do you do this? You know, we don't go into a session saying, you know, today I'm going to disclose this about myself. Or I'm going to, you know, I think I'll talk about my kids today. That's not how it happens. Somebody asks us a question, maybe a new client or a client we've worked with for a long time with a particularly challenging session, or they're in a lot of psychological pain, and they say, how do you do this? And, you know, in one way it could be a throwaway question. It may actually be not just rhetorical. They really may want to know. And then we often make a decision at the moment, how am I going to respond to this? Sometimes we fumble, sometimes we can do it elegantly, but we will make a decision about whether to say, you know, I make sure to take care of myself. I make sure that I really listen while I'm here and find other things to do so that I don't get overwhelmed, because sometimes people's suffering is pretty intense. Well, there are some clients I may never say that to, right? And other clients who I might say that to, and that would be okay. So we usually do these responses in the moment, and then after the fact, we brood sometimes about whether that was a good idea, or did I, you know, when I didn't respond, was it good? You know, so these are kind of difficult. And what I want to suggest with when we do have a choice in the matter, when it's not internet, okay, when we don't have a choice, is to ask ourselves some questions with colleagues, but also particularly, like, what was I hoping to do there? What was the purpose of my disclosure or my withholding the information? Did it seem to help or not help, at least short term? And we all know that this stuff sometimes can have echoes. You know, it regularly surprises me when I work with folks that I will say something that I think is just innocuous, or at the end of the session, as I'm trying to help contain the affect that occurred during the session, and I'll say one line, and then 4 months later, somebody said, the most important thing you've said in this whole therapy to me was this line I never remember saying. Now, it wasn't like I was not aware of trying to say something and do something, but people will pick up on things that are important to them and really fit at the time or don't fit. So how might it help? And then what do I get out of the disclosure if I make the disclosure? It's harder often to not disclose, at least in my experience. And if I am disclosing, is it more for my client or more for me? And it's not that it's ever going to be completely always for the client, but how much? What's the balance? If it's more for me, I want to prove to them that I can understand this aspect of their life, and I mask it in terms of, well, it'll make a difference in the relationship. I want to be really thoughtful about that. I want to be thinking about, well, so what was I doing there? Am I feeling uncertain about my ability to help? Am I feeling questioned? Am I questioning myself? Where am I in terms of my countertransference with this particular client? My liking, my disliking, my sense of safety. Really important, where are we in terms of our alliance? Do we have a good working alliance going here? And sometimes it can be very helpful to disclose something small in the context of an alliance that's gotten ruptured, including things like admitting a mistake. Those can be pretty powerful moments. But is that for me or is that for the client? And then, does my self-disclosure cut against my client's cultural norms or flow with them? So, just to give you a brief example, I was working with a couple where it was fascinating. There were 5 cultures in the room with just the 3 of us. So both of these members of the couple were bicultural. One was bilingual. And so there was this juggling going on. And one of the members of the couple was asking me very direct questions about myself. And that often happens, how long have you been married and do you have kids? And the standard questions. And I initially deflected. I initially said, well, so are you worried about that? And she said, oh, no, I just want to know who I'm working with. And it was really kind of culturally consistent for her. This is like, I need to know who you are. And so I started to describe, briefly. I only spent about half an hour talking about my son. And then I showed the video. And as soon as I began to describe just a limited amount of information about me, I saw the other member of the couple stiffen, physically stiffen. And the message I got was, no, I don't want to know these things about you. I don't want to have that kind. It was interesting because I had this pull to do 2 different things, but it was such a classic example of how, for some cultures, it's really expected that one is going to be more self-disclosing, that you should be. For other cultures, no. And it's too much. Even a little is too much. And we end up having to kind of gauge. Sometimes we do not know. And in that case, I decided to gently but quickly move away from description of myself. And then try to balance so I could say enough for this one person that they could get a feel, and at the same time not spend that 45 minutes that I wanted to spend. The results of self-disclosure are also important to be attentive to. Sometimes it just goes flat. Sometimes it makes no difference whatever, right? Sometimes self-disclosure is very potent. It's not my own experience, but one of my colleagues works a lot with teenagers and was running a group around substance abuse prevention with teenagers in a school setting. And it had been going on for a few months. And good group, the kids were really active. Sometimes they'd get very resistant and kind of, poochy, but it was a good group. And my colleague was experiencing some significant loss in his life. Very, very important person in his life had died. And he was aware that he was kind of functioning on not all cylinders, doing okay, but not all cylinders. And of course, one of his very perceptive kids in the group said, Dr. R, you look upset. And he said he struggled. And this was a kid who was particularly difficult to reach. This is one of those kids who was always kind of lobbing grenades from the farther reaches of the group. And he decided that he would give a brief description of the loss. He said, I am having a hard time. And the whole group got deadly silent. And he said, I've lost somebody really important to me, so I'm very sad. And a few of the kids gave some very both age appropriate but also socially appropriate responses. And this other youngster who had been a very kind of removed member of the group started disclosing in the group every week. So it was tricky. He could have said, "I'm fine," and the kids would have probably gotten the nonverbals, believed them, discarded the verbal, but kept going, because everybody does that. So it was a tricky moment, but it had a potent effect on that group. And so these are not easy decisions to make, but we want to be reflective about the results of them, thinking about what happens. And one of the ways we can do that is we can bring it to colleagues who are willing to be independent in their thinking, but also respectful of our approaches. And so we can have the conversations. I could take it, for example, to you and say, "So this is what I did, and I was a little uncomfortable." And you go, "Well, what happened?" So consultation around these kinds of things are really good, and thoughtful and empathic, because often we're responding at the moment. And as you were mentioning earlier, sometimes we just bumble it. It's kind of like we don't carry it very well. But to talk about what was it that kind of got us, and both helping us improve for the next time we get asked a question like that, but also, did it work with this particular client, and how might we follow up? So really kind of thinking about those self-disclosures as part of our usual repertoire. If we reflect on it and we consult, and it just doesn't seem to be, maybe it's not a bad idea, but not a good one, I tend to err on the side of caution, rather than disclosing more, just being a little bit more cautious. But if your sense was it was really important, it can be a really useful lesson. The reason I'm talking about this is there's some literature that I read where people either say all self-disclosure is fine or none. And I really don't think that either or is appropriate for the work that almost anyone does now. And that I want to clarify that I don't believe, unless I'm taking it into really a more extreme venue, where it's all about me, all about you as the therapist and not the client, that it becomes an ethical issue. It's more a technical issue. It's about how we intervene, what works with a particular client or couple or family, and how we maintain that relationship. Not, you disclosed that you had kids, and you do it in therapy, but people know your custody evaluation. You shouldn't have done that. That was unethical. It's not unethical. It's usually in response to a whole host of factors, and all I'm suggesting is that we think about that.